Record. I'm recording. Hello, everyone. My name is Carmen Ignacio, and my presentation is on Emiliano Zapata's legacy in Mexico, or most importantly, the Zapatista movement. So, just to give a brief review on what a stateless nation is, they're an ethnic group or nation without its own sovereign state. Usually they're minorities in the state that they inhabit. In this case, the Zapatista movement um, was made up of indigenous groups like the Mayans in Mexico, um, which can also be seen as a stateless nation. So, just to give some historical background, the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1910 to 1920, was a massive social and political, was a time of massive social and political unrest or turmoil. It all started as a revolt against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, who had ruled Mexico for over 30 decades. Um, During his dictatorship, Diaz's policy heavily favored the wealthy elite and foreign investors, while Mexico's rural indigenous communities were neglected and exploited. In the southern part of the country, a revolutionary leader named Emiliano Zapata emerged. Um, he was born in 1879, and Zapata became a voice for the poor indigenous community who were struggling with extreme land inequality. Under Diaz, communal lands that indigenous communities had held for generations were taken away and given to large landowners. The Zapatista movement aimed to reverse this injustice. He became really famous for his rallying cry of Tierra y Libertad, or land and freedom. In 1911, he laid out his vision for reform in a document called El Plan de Ayala. Um, this plan called for expropriation of large estates and redistribution of the land to the indigenous community. Um, which really set Zapata apart from his other revolutionary leaders because he primarily focused on land reform to improve the lives of Mexico's indigenous community. Zapata's ideals strongly resonated with the indigenous community and rural populations, and to this day, he remains a powerful symbol of resistance and social reform. So the EZLN, sometimes I refer to them as the Zapatistas, or they're also known as Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, which was founded in 1983, but it wasn't until January 1st of 1994 that they made international headlines. This was the day the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, came into effect, and on that same day, the Zapatistas declared war on the Mexican government. Their uprising was a direct response to neoliberal policies introduced by NAFTA, which they believe would worsen the already difficult conditions for indigenous communities in southern Mexico, particularly in Chiapas, which was one of the country's poorest region. These policies favored large-scale agribusiness and foreign corporations, which made it harder for indigenous people to maintain control over their lands and livelihoods. But in 1994, or the rebellion from 1994, wasn't just about NAFTA. It was also part of a much larger and longer struggle for land rights and indigenous autonomy, which was a fight that goes all the way back to the ideals of Emiliano Zapata during the Mexican Revolution. Um, so the Zapatistas were fighting for, again, redistribution of land and for the rights of marginalized indigenous populations who seek to govern themselves. Um, uh, in conclusion, the EZLN uprising was a modern continuation of the Zapatista legacy, keeping alive the call for tierra y libertad, or land and freedom, but now in the context of global trade and economic exploitation. Okay. Um, So the Zapatista movement is built around three core ideals that have driven their struggle for decades. Um, the first one would be indigenous rights. The movement is fundamentally about restoring dignity and autonomy to the indigenous populations of Mexico. These communities have faced poverty, land disposition, and a lack of access to basic services like education and healthcare. So the Zapatistas aim to uplift these communities and give them control over their own futures. The second would be autonomy. The Zapatistas demand self-governance for indigenous people, meaning that they should have the right to make decisions over their land, their resources, and local affairs without interference from the Mexican government. And this push for autonomy is a way to reclaim control over their traditional lands and to preserve their cultural identities. The last one would be anti-neoliberalism. The Zapatistas oppose the global trade policies and economic systems and see as exploiting indigenous lands for corporate profit. They argue that these policies like NAFTA deepen social inequalities and cause further harm to already vulnerable communities. Um, to put these ideals into practice, the Zapatistas have created several autonomies in Chiapas, known as caracoles. In these communities, local people govern themselves. And again, they emphasize communal land ownership. They've also established their own education, healthcare, and legal systems, showing that self-governance can be real, functioning, real and functioning, and a functioning alternative to centralized government control. So the influence of the Zapatistas has extended far beyond Mexico, and it's resonating with anti-globalization movements around the world. The Zapatistas' principles of indigenous self-determination and their strong critique of global capitalism have inspired activists who are fighting for human rights and environmental justice. Many people across the globe see the Zapatistas as defenders of not only indigenous rights, but also as champions against the exploitation and environmental destruction bought on by corporate-driven economic policies. So when we think about stateless nations, the connection becomes clear. Like many stateless people, the indigenous communities in Chiapas, mainly of Mayan descent, have been marginalized for centuries by the central Mexican government. Their struggle isn't just for land, but for the recognition of their autonomy and cultural identity, which is a struggle that is echoed by many stateless nations across the world. The Zapatistas represents the ongoing fight for self-determination, freedom from oppressive political systems, and the right to govern their own lands and lives, just like other stateless people around the globe. So just to kind of wrap this up, Emiliano Zapata became a powerful symbol of both indigenous and peasant resistance in Mexico. His fight for land reforms and his advocacy for the rights of marginalized communities left a lasting mark on Mexican society. The changes he pushed for, particularly around the redistribution of land, continues to influence social movements today. Um, so the Zapatista movement remains highly relevant even now, as it represents more than just a local struggle in Mexico. It has become a symbol of the broader fight of stateless nations worldwide, groups that are marginalized and denied their rights, and groups that are fighting for autonomy, recognition, and freedom. Whether it's indigenous people in Mexico or stateless nations across the globe, the Zapatista cause reflects a universal struggle for dignity and self-determination. And that is it.